Hello, my name is Andy Verzosa, and I'm here at Stanley-Whitman House. It's January 14th, 2021, and we're pre-recording this panel discussion for presentation on January 25th, 2021, in observance of the hanging of Mary Barnes' 358th anniversary. Let me tell you a little bit about why we're doing this panel today. We are observing the 358th anniversary of the hanging of Mary Barnes. And we do this from Stanley-Whitman House from the Mary Barnes Society. The Mary Barnes Society at Stanley-Whitman House is dedicated to supporting the study of the Connecticut Witch Trials with the goal of a deeper understanding of the people and cultures of this seminal time in history. Named for Mary Barnes, a Farmington woman who was executed for witchcraft on January 25th, 1663, the Society will mark the 358th anniversary of her hanging by premiering a series of online presentations on the museum's YouTube channel. And this presentation is going to be the fourth of that series. I want to introduce a few of the people out here on the panel. And I first want to thank you all for being on the panel. First, we have Beth Caruso, and she is passionate about telling stories of women from earlier times. She's the author of One of Windsor, the untold story of America's first witch hanging, and The Salty Rose, Alchemists, Witches, and a Tapper in New Amsterdam, for which she was awarded a literary prize in genre fiction in 2020. Beth is co-founder of the Connecticut Witch Memorial Facebook page. Beth is co-founder of the Connecticut Witch Memorial Facebook page. That is a tongue twister. Tony Griego is a Vietnam-era Army veteran. He retired as a sergeant from the New Haven Police Department in 1998. He first became interested in the Salem witch trials after a visit to Salem, Massachusetts in 1992. After attending a lecture in 2005 given by Walter Woodard, after attending a lecture in 2005 by Walter Woodward, Connecticut state historian, he learned that Connecticut had its first witch hanging in 1647. In 2017, he was part of the effort to clear the names of Alice Stone, Lydia Gilbert, and Windsor. Tony is the co-founder of the Connecticut Witch Memorial Facebook page. Virginia Woolf is founder of Her Story Theater, bringing to life the unsung heroines of history, as well as producing a host of projects that celebrate women in history and a simple love of theater and performing. Her play, Panic in Connecticut, Accused Witches Have Their Say, was inspired by research on the Connecticut witchcraft panics at the Stanley-Whitman House, which led to the birth of Her Story Theater. A little bit about Stanley-Whitman House. We just observed our 300th birthday on December 31st, 2020. And I'm just very eager to hear what my panelists have to say. And without further ado, I'm going to ask, why should we be marking this occasion of the 358th anniversary of Mary Barnes' hanging?
Well, it's not just the anniversary of yes, it is of Mary Barnes' hanging, but she was also the last person to be hanged for witchcraft in Connecticut, which the first person to be hanged in the New World was Alice Young in 1647. So really there 11 people in the end were executed for witchcraft. So it's not just about Mary Barnes, although the Mary Barnes Society is a great way to encapsulate all of this. But it was really the end of an awful era in Connecticut's history that we're celebrating as well as acknowledging.
So she was the last to be hanged, but the people that were accused of being witches, that didn't necessarily end with Mary Barnes being hanged, correct?
Yes, that's correct. That was the last hanging in 1663, but the witch trials continued all the way up to 1724.
And that precedes the Salem witch trials by how many years?
30-some years.
Yes, we stopped hanging people for witchcraft 30 years before the Salem witchcraft panic started.
Right. The timeline is really interesting because a lot of people don't know about the Connecticut trials, but it's important to in relation to the Salem trials. As previously mentioned, 1647 was the very first one. And in those first 7 years in Connecticut, 7 people were accused and convicted and hanged. So the ratio of accusation and indictment and hanging was 7 for 7. So they were pretty brutal. And all that was roughly 40 years before the Salem trials even started. And then the Hartford Witch Panic took place 1662 to 1663. So that's a good 30 years before.
Mhm.
So why do each of you do what you do around the Connecticut witch trials or the panics?
Well, I think it's important that the people in Connecticut know about this history. It's only recently in the last 50 years or so that people even knew that Connecticut had trials. So I think it's important that we should know our history, even though it's a terrible history, it's important.
It's important to me, even though there's not as much historical documentation as the Salem trials, it's still just as important. And you can't use the excuse that, well, there's not as much documentation, so we wouldn't talk about them. If that were the case, then the only history that would ever be presented to us would be the history of those in power. And so for seeing the viewpoints of others, it's extremely important. Most of the people who were hanged were women. So it's a part of women's history. It's a part of, the women that got in trouble history. But there were some men that were hanged as well.
So in Europe, there was a 300-year span of witch persecutions, right? And that came over to the New World. So would the Connecticut witch trials and witch panic, would that be the first that we know of in the New World and the English colonies?
Yes. Yes. And it's interesting, the first settlers, if you go up to Plymouth Plantation, there is no history of witchcraft accusations or anything there with those very first settlers. It took a generation of people's having experience and of having more people coming together and not knowing them, for this to start bubbling again. But it was rooted in a staunch belief that God was good, the devil was bad, the devil makes bad things happen, and the devil, one of the ways the devil acts is by making pacts with mostly women, through whom he can work, and they would be the witches. So they came here. They didn't make this up. The Bible said, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," and they were very Bible oriented, and it was a hearty belief.
Right. And they weren't just influenced by their past. When they founded Windsor in 1633, there were a lot of things that happened up to the point that they decided to hang Alice Young in Hartford later on. But it wasn't just the past history and the exposure to talking about witches and magical thinking. In 1646, there was a civil war going on in England, and there was a man called Matthew Hopkins who named himself the Witchfinder General. And he killed and hanged more people in a 2-year period than had happened in the total previous 200 years. And at that time in England, people from opposing sides were calling each other witches. And his book, his manual, his terrible manual that he came up with during that time, he had sent over, someone had gotten it from England, and it was found in the colonies, and it was actually used in a witchcraft case in Salem for Margaret Jones. And that happened in 1648. So it may be possible that somebody in Windsor got a hold of that book and used it in the case of Alice Young as well.
You wouldn't by chance have the title of that book?
You know what? I can look it up for you.
Malleus Baracarum.
No, not that one.
Oh, a
It was
discovery of
another
witches?
one. Yes, that's it. Thank you. Thank you. A Discovery of Witches. And it was a terrible guidebook. Thank you, Tony. It was a terrible, terrible guidebook about how you can find out if somebody's a witch, and a torture manual about the ways you could torture them.
I think the audience or people listening to this panel might be curious to know, back in those times, what would you look for to determine if someone was a witch, or what would be the criteria?
Well, it started with even just suspicion, and women were the ones who generally came under suspicion. There were for a couple of reasons. First of all, of course, women were the weaker sex, so they were more susceptible to the devil taking them over. We know differently today, but that's where they came from then. So any woman who was different in some way, was perhaps more outspoken, perhaps had property, did things that they did not feel in the Puritan tradition was right, that women were supposed to be inferior and not have power, not have thoughts and all of that. So right away, suspicion could be brought up, and that would start the whole thing. They were the healers. The women were the ones who knew medicine to the degree that medicine was known. They were there when people were born. They were there when people died, for whatever reason it might be. And how many trying to find a reason for bad things to happen is pretty easy when you know that the devil makes them happen, and this woman who was at the bedside might have been acting as the devil and causing a death. There was a logic to it that we don't follow now, but you can't judge them by today. There was a logic to a lot of it that, but there was also, as in, we think about this Matthew going off and hunting witches. I mean, what a power trip. What power to know that people fear you and you can say whatever you want and you can actually have the influence to kill people. So many things going on.
So if we were to think of the context of those times, these are Puritans, they're in a new world, they're on the frontier. Could you kind of help me fill in a picture for people who are listening in or watching this panel?
I think
well in your book.
Go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Tony.
Well, I think during those times, they were living under really dire conditions. People died. There was really a lot of things going on with Native Americans. Native Americans were considered the devils. So they were living in a period that there was a lot of things in their life that we don't experience now.
Right.
Might we be experiencing a little bit of what they experienced then with the coronavirus, an epidemic?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. The very first case of Alice Young, the one who was hanged in 1647, an epidemic was probably a huge reason why she was hanged. In the town of Windsor in 1647, an influenza epidemic came through. The death rate went up dramatically. Alice Young was also part of a group that was different from the majority group in town. Most of them were from the southwest of England. And Alice's group, looking at different historical records, they were from Windsor, England, as well as places near London. Well, Windsor and London are fairly close together. And in those days, the group differences would have been pretty dramatic. Their speech would have been different. Even if they were all Puritans, they may have viewed their Puritanism or practiced it in different ways. So add on top of that, an epidemic and increased deaths, and a whole bunch of them right near where Alice Young is. Her daughter doesn't die, but other people's children do. And you have a toxic mix of circumstances, some of which we really have no way of knowing too. What was Alice Young's personality like? We don't know that either. Many things could be happening at once.
And the actual panics that Connecticut had in 1663, then in 1693, did come at times. Also in the early 1660s, there was a pandemic. For 2 years, people were dying. They had some flooding and terrible weather happened. So people were looking for God's angry. What's going on here? How can we protect ourselves? They searched out Alice Young, and then they searched out other women too later on. So
They were looking for a scapegoat for what was
the
happening.
panics did come at a time when there was heightened fear, whether it's the Native Americans, whether it was sickness, whether it was weather related, whatever that might be.
So I want to go back to how you will tell this story, right? Through the various mediums that you use, whether it be through writing a play, writing a book, putting together information for a Facebook page dedicated to remembering people who were affected by the witchcraft trials. So how do you use your medium to share this information, and you know, what are you looking at? What are the facts? What's your point of reference? And then from there, describe that and describe how you use your creative process and make connections. And it's kind of like I'm asking you to think of this. I mean, you're give me all the ingredients that you would use to bake a cake, and then tell me the process and right up to the point where you finish icing that cake and you present it ready for cutting and tall glasses of milk. You mind starting off, Judy?
Sure. Well, for me, it started out in a little bit of a shallow way, I suppose, because I am an actress. And when I started becoming aware of the history here in Connecticut, my first thought was, these are amazing stories that need to be told. And that's what led me into the research. As I developed the play, Panic in Connecticut, Accused Witches Have Their Say, I found 5 women whose collective experiences from Lydia Gilbert, 1654, I think, through Mercy Disbrow, 1693, would hopefully give the span of what being accused of witchcraft was like. So I had to pick and choose of the many stories. I mean, it's true, there's not a lot of records, but there's enough for me to have had to decide, well, which stories are the ones that will tie together well. And then for me, taking that as a performance is, of course, a great honor and a great joy, but exposing people very often for the first time to the fact that this was even happening in Connecticut. And it's nice and it's encapsulated because it's a 40-minute performance and then there's Q&A afterwards. So I get great satisfaction out of not only performing my little heart out, but also bringing this to people, to libraries and historic societies, to children, people that have no idea that this ever happened. And I hope that it's a springboard. And that's what I will say is, you can Google Connecticut witchcraft panics and come up with an awful lot of information if you're now interested. So,
Tony, would you share a little bit about your Facebook page that you put together with Beth?
Sure, but it's a little bit of a longer story. Back in 2005, Professor Woodward gave a talk on the Connecticut Witch Trials. Afterwards, several people asked him if anything had been done in the state of Connecticut to recognize that or clear their names, and nothing had been done. So we started the process, and by 2008, 3 descendants were able to testify before the General Assembly in Connecticut for a proclamation clearing the names of 11 people. They focused on 11 people who were hanged, lost their lives. And even though they testified for almost 45 minutes, it was never voted on. So the following year, it was presented again before the General Assembly and it again didn't pass. The next thing we looked at was a pardon. Interestingly, unlike other New England states, in Connecticut, the governor cannot pardon anyone. That goes to the Board of Pardons and Paroles. And they, in turn, I wrote to them, and they do not pardon dead people. So that was a dead end. We wrote to the Queen of England because we were under the authority of the Crown during all our trials here in Connecticut. And her staff wrote me back that all the cases would have to be reopened, which is really not going to happen because there's so many records that are missing and fragmented. And also they thought it would be a colonial problem. Well, in 2015, I met Beth Caruso because of an article that was in the Hartford Courant. So the two of us formed this Connecticut Witch Memorial Facebook page to jointly get the message out to the people in Connecticut of these trials. So that's really it. And that's the Reader's Digest version.
I appreciate you sharing that. And I'm curious, for you, Tony, how do you feel about administering this page? Like, how does that work for you? So we get a good sense from Ginny when she's acting and she presents the play. And we know that when Beth presents a book and she does readings and people buy her book, what measurement of satisfaction do you get from doing the Facebook page?
Well, I get a lot of satisfaction. And how we do it is there was 11 people that lost their lives. There was all total, there was 42 people that were accused, tried, some hanged here for witchcraft. So on a regular, maybe not on a regular basis, but we take a biography of each case and write a short story on our Connecticut Witch Memorial Facebook page. So the people get educated to all the people that were involved in the trials.
So I guess for me, we spoke before, and when we did your presentation last week, you were wonderful describing the responses that descendants had in being able to post and to share information and learn things from the Facebook page. Is there something that you could share with us before I move on to Beth, that you could kind of illustrate what that is like, being the administrator of that page?
Well, it was very exciting. And the reason why is many of the people that started to comment on the stories or posts that we put on our page, that they were descendants 8 times removed. And there were so many of them all across the United States. There are thousands of descendants of people that were accused of witchcraft right here in Connecticut.
And they have varying degrees of interest and connection. Could you share a little bit more about that? I hate to be so leading and draw this out of you, but I think it's important for folks to hear.
Well, a lot of people apparently are doing a genealogy research into their family, and they may be surprised when they come across somebody who was charged with witchcraft. And that's one of the things that they mention when they make a comment. And there's other people that are generally concerned with the history of trials. It's, Salem is fascinating, their history. And here we have the same history right here in Connecticut that most people are not aware of.
And there was one other thing that you shared in our panel, and I just want to end this with you, this thought. You said that sometimes there wasn't direct evidence, that sometimes you had to find it a different way. Could you share that? And you were talking about a defamation case.
Well, the later defamation cases that took place in, towards Fairfield, uh, where there's more information in a defamation case than there are in witch trial cases. Most of the information about how the courts operated came from a defamation case, I think, out of Fairfield.
Very good. And Beth, I know that you too do considerable research. All three of you do. And could you share a little bit about that process of writing a historical novel and where you go from your research to creating a novel?
Well, it is a long process. In the case of Alice Young, the only two records that were available to me initially were the Matthew Grant Diary, which was the old Windsor church record, as well. And on the inside cover of that, it said Alice Young was hanged, and the date May the 26th, 1647. The other record was through John Winthrop Sr. in the colony of Massachusetts, who kept a record of all these things. And he just said, one blank of Windsor arraigned and executed for a witch in Hartford. So that's all I had to go on. But I was lucky in that one day a revelation kind of came to me when I was reading just background information about the Puritans, where it said that their neighborhoods were even more important than their church groups, the immediate neighborhoods that they hung out in. And I thought, oh, aha. Well, since there's not a lot of information about Alice Young, I'm going to research everybody in her neighborhood, and I'm going to piece together who was living in that neighborhood in 1647. And I went through the Windsor land records, and that really helped form a story in my mind. And then on top of that, I did use the Matthew Grant diary beyond that one reference to Alice Young. In that Matthew Grant diary are a whole bunch of vital statistics. And so it shows you who died in 1647, who were they? And it's interesting because two of the children who died were the Reverend Warhams. Another child that died was the doctor's child. A couple other ones were related to important magistrates in the town. So these were all really important things that helped me piece together what may have happened. And then, of course, there are still blanks with any story, and you have to fill those in a way that makes logical sense with the hard, documentation that you've actually found. So that's how that happened.
So I know that here researchers are looking at a number of different sources for records, land records, ledgers,
Right.
letters if they exist, and whatnot. And it's interesting that in the case of one of Windsor, you're looking at basically an entry in a family Bible that exists at the town meeting house. So I want to direct this to Ginny. You did a lot of research here through Stanley-Whitman House with the guidance of Lisa Johnson, and then you had a relationship here with our museum. So do you mind sharing a little bit about that? And I guess with the goal of, with all of you, I'm just thinking there are probably a lot of people out there that could probably try to do what you do and add to this body of knowledge and research. So do you mind sharing a little bit about that?
Well, it was interesting. I first got involved. Lisa Johnson had written a play, The Preternatural Way, The Witchcraft Trial of Mary Barnes. And it was a large cast play that docents to the Stanley-Whitman and local people, and I got to play Mary Barnes. in that. And that was all part of this effort to pull together all the become a resource for the Connecticut witchcraft panics. And I remember sitting in on a meeting with Walt Woodward. He was there, and this was how long ago? It was 10, 12 years ago now, I
2007 or
guess.
something like that.
Long
Yeah.
time ago, exactly. So even technology wise, we're so much further than we were then. But there was this desire to at least start seeing where are all the different pieces, so that if people at least can go find them if they want to find them. Um, and that's what prompted me to be so curious about, okay, so this is Mary Barnes, but there were 11 hanged and 45 accused. So who were they and what were their stories? And I remember Facebook was brand new way back then too. And I got home, and Facebook used to say something like, so what's on your mind? And I typed in Connecticut witchcraft. And a classmate of mine from Marblehead, Massachusetts, I was actually born in Salem, piped in. She lives in Colorado, and she piped in, oh, Mary Staples, my great, 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 was accused twice. And then I had to go learn about Mary Staples. And one thing built on another. And Beth, it's the same thing. You go down rabbit holes, and then you have to figure out what makes the most sense. Mary Barnes, of the 5 women whose stories I tell a little bit about, she's near and dear to my heart because she was the first one, but also she, of the 5 women, the least is known. And so I was able to take literary license and think about what her life was like and what was it like on the day you're going to be hanged. And she has 4 children. She's married. She went to trial. We don't know if she had the water test, if they checked her for witch marks and all of that. None of that's documented. And I tried to stay away from going away from fact. I didn't want to make things up that didn't happen. And other Mercy Dispro, Lydia Gilbert, Judith Varlet, and Mary Staples, all it's documented actual things that happened to them as part of their accusation. We don't know that about Mary. So she became my gallows speech, and looking into her heart and saying, what was that like? And as the video shows, hopefully it's kind of heart-wrenching because what an awful,
Yes.
awful thing to, we don't have that equivalent now. In a way, we actually, a woman was just executed under capital punishment yesterday, I believe.
Right.
She was mentally ill, it seems, and she'd spent all this time incarcerated. And I don't know. It's a very human story. So I shouldn't even draw that parallel, because who knows what she was thinking before she was executed.
So again, I want to thank you all for being part of the panel and doing your presentations. During this time of COVID, things have been interesting. We're all learning new things, and certainly my doing a Zoom panel and doing these video recordings is a first for me. And what I'm fascinated with is that creative people can tell stories today and draw from the past. And my work, I believe, here at Stanley-Whitman House is to keep that going, to make that engagement possible, to support people in their interests in history, and to trying to connect them to the tools and impart the research skills, and to show them people in the community that are doing this work and how they're doing it. So my hat's off to all 3 of you. As an author, Beth, it's wonderful. I know that I don't have the books here in front of me, but One of Windsor and The Salty Rose. These are 2 books. Do you have the covers?
I do. I have, oh, well, it's hard with this
Yes.
fake background.
Yeah.
And this is One of Windsor. I actually wanted to know if it would be okay if I read all of the 11 names of the people who died in the Connecticut Witch Trials,
Sure.
just so people can remember them.
And why
Okay.
don't we have you read those as we close, and
Okay.
and then And if you wouldn't mind, would you be reading their names and saying where they're from, the places that they were from?
Yes, and the year.
Wonderful. Thank you for doing that. And, and then, when I think about what you're doing, Tony and Beth, with the Connecticut Witch Memorial Facebook page, I think that that's so, current and such a great resource for people, particularly for descendants, but also for people who are interested and just want to kind of get a sense of what happened. I think that learning from the stories that you post and then what people share is exciting. I've been going to the Facebook page periodically and just checking in and just really intrigued with what people are posting. And then, of course, Ginny, having you here at the house, doing your play and doing one act that has to do with Mary Barnes here in the lean-to attic was a highlight of my tenure here, my 3-year tenure here at the Stanley-Whitman House.
Biggest place I've ever performed.
It's creepy, right? Nails coming down from the roof and whatnot. But I think, there's, history matters. There's a lot to learn about humanity and the lack thereof through examples in history, and then, bringing them into the present in the right context or a certain context is so important. And with that, I want to ask you, Beth, if you're ready, why don't you
I'm ready.
say those names, and then what we'll do is we'll pause briefly and then we'll end the panel. Is there anything that anyone wants to say before I end the panel and have Beth read the names?
Just thank you for keeping this part of history alive as well. It's nice to have a place for it to live.
Well, this is where history lives, Stanley-Whitman House, right?
Yes, thank you very much. On behalf of CT Witch Memorial and Tony and myself. So in memory of the 11 Connecticut witch trial victims, Alice Young of Windsor, 1647. Mary Johnson of Wethersfield died in 1648. John and Joan Carrington of Wethersfield. They died in 1651. Goody Bassett of Stratford, 1651. Goody Knapp of Fairfield, 1653. Lydia Gilbert of Windsor, 1654. I'm sorry, Goody Bassett of Stratford, it's 1651. I think I might have said a different year. Mary Sanford of Hartford, 1662. Nathaniel and Rebecca Greensmith of Hartford, 1663. And Mary Barnes of Farmington, 1663.
Thank you, Beth. And with that,
And I'd like to add to that also. May
sure,
I?
sure.
Of those 11 names that she just mentioned, none of those people were given a Christian burial. After they were executed, they were thrown in an unmarked grave. So there's no place really for a family to anchor to. Descendants, there's nothing to look for as far as graves go.
Well, maybe that might be something that could be corrected or changed in the future.
Well, it can, down the road, hopefully some sort of a memorial or recognition. It's already been done in Fairfield.
Well,
So
I don't know whose phone that was, but thank you. But well, thank you, Tony. And what I'm going to do is just thank you once again for being on the panel. And I look forward to our next live Zoom reception. And I want to welcome people watching the panel to join us. And if you have questions or comments, please share them with us. And we'll be doing that live. Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.